Hey, folks. Hey, everybody out there. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm a Master Cicerone. I'm the content director for the Cicerone certification program. And this week on Tasting Together, we're going to be talking about American barley wine. So, what we've done almost every week since sometime in April, get together every Wednesday to talk about some element of beer-related topic. Oftentimes, we're going to be talking about a beer style. Try to do so in a sort of lighthearted fashion, cover sort of the basics of the topic, and then make sure that I get to any questions that you guys have. So if you are back from last week, I believe last week we had Neil in here talking about all things Oktoberfest. If you missed that, definitely worth checking out. If this is your first time, like I always say, make sure throw out questions as we go through. I want to make sure that I'm answering the things that you want to know about the topic that we're talking about, because that's going to make it more valuable and more exciting for you guys. So throw out questions as you have them. I won't necessarily answer them right when they're asked, but I'll try to get to all of the questions before we're done. In terms of upcoming schedule, I was on the road for the last couple of weeks. I just got back really late last night, so we haven't built out the full schedule for the rest of October, but we did plan for next week. Next week, we're going to be doing Belgian Triple. And then by the time we have the session next week, we'll have the remainder of October and maybe even into November planned out a little bit. I haven't thought too much about it yet, but I feel like I don't want to talk about pumpkin beer, but I feel like maybe we'll throw pumpkin beer in there for a week. Who knows? Who knows what will happen? Anyways, this week we're talking about American barley wine, and I'm seeing a few people throwing out what they're drinking, seeing some Bigfoot. I myself am having Anchor's Old Foghorn, classic example of the style. And then when it comes to glassware for this style, oftentimes you're going to see people use something that is a little bit smaller in size. One of the hallmarks of the barley wine style is that it is high in alcohol. And so a lot of times when we serve high alcohol styles, we want to serve them in a glass that's a little bit smaller to allow for a slightly more reasonable serving size. Though some people are all about taking a bomber of barley wine to the dome, but in service settings, usually you're going to want to give somebody, I could see this style being served anywhere from like a 6 to a 10 ounce pour. 12 ounces is like, that's where I'm like, okay, that's as much barley wine as I want to have in most cases. So in terms of glassware that people might pick, tulip is a pretty common choice. Snifter is another common choice. Anything with a stem that's a little bit smaller, I could see somebody using to serve a barley wine in. And one of the questions that I got, actually, I had at least one person reach out to me on Instagram before this to ask about serving temperature for this style. In a lot of cases with higher alcohol styles, usually they benefit from being served a little bit warmer. Something like a German Pilsner or a wit beer. You usually want to serve that pretty cold, maybe like 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like, I don't want to mess up, but like 5-ish. No, it's a little lower than that, like 4 degrees Celsius, I think. So between 4 and 5 degrees Celsius or around 40 degrees Fahrenheit for a style like that. For something like a barley wine, you might want to go around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 10 to 13 degrees Celsius. So yeah, oftentimes you'll want to serve these beers a little bit warmer. I pulled mine from the fridge about a half an hour before we got started just so that it would be able to warm up a little bit. But one of the things that I also usually will tell people when it comes to serving temperature is I usually recommend you start out a little bit cooler than the ideal range. I would aim to get this, at least in my glass, at like 45 degrees Fahrenheit. In a service setting, you probably would want to more closely target the low end of the appropriate serving range. But when I'm at home, I'm going to pour it a little bit colder than that still, because once the beer is in the glass, it's very easy to like get it to warm up. You either can like cup it in your hands or you can just wait. But if you serve it and you're like, it's a little too warm, it's harder to get it to cool down. I mean, you can throw it in the fridge for a bit in the glass, but it's going to be losing carbonation. So in general, my recommendation to people when they're drinking at home, if you're serving a beer like this, is serve it a little bit cooler than you think you want to enjoy it. And then if you want to warm it up, put your hands on the glass or just wait. And one of the things that is really interesting, I think, about these sorts of beers is they're more of a sipping beer. I saw somebody throw Quaff Life out there. I don't know that I would necessarily apply. I don't consider barley wines to be among the many crushable styles of beer that are out there. This is a sipping beer for me. And so this is going to be one that you're going to drink over a period of time. And the beer is naturally going to warm over that period of time. And one of the things that is really interesting about these beers is that you can pay attention or notice how the beer changes as the temperature increases. And it will change over the course of a session of drinking a glass of one of these beers. So let's dig right in. Talk a little bit about the history of American barley wine. And American barley wine, like a lot of classic American styles, think like American Pale Ale, American Porter, American Stout, American IPA. All of these styles are descended from English styles, and barley wine is no different. Barley wine, American barley wine at least, is descended from English barley wine. So since we haven't done a session on English barley wine, I'll talk a little bit about the history of that style, even though it is a little bit murky. English, the UK today is, their drinking culture is built around session beers. Beers that are relatively low in alcohol. They're like OG Quaff Life at this point. But you've got a lot of like 3 to 4% alcohol bitters. These are beers that you can drink pint after pint after pint and still be in decent shape. Go back about 100 years or 150 years, and England was definitely known for its production of strong ales at that period in history. A lot of different types of strong ales were made by different breweries in that time period. And, what gets called a barley wine and what doesn't, it's a little bit up to interpretation. To my knowledge, the first beer that was named as a barley wine was a beer from Bass, and they labeled a beer as a barley wine in, I think, the 1870s. And we saw some other breweries follow suit over the coming decades. Like I said, like the history of barley wine is a little bit murky and didn't always follow a clear trajectory. But you take that into American barley wine. The first example that I know of, I believe the first example of the style, was Anchor's Old Foghorn, which was released for the first time in 1975. And the first renditions of barley wine, very similar to what American breweries did when American breweries made the first examples of American Pale Ale or American IPA, taking a UK style, adapting it to the ingredients that they had available to them, and as happened with virtually all styles that have been Americanized, adding a lot more hops than were added in the British version of the beer. So Anchor Old Foghorn, like I mentioned, was the first one. I believe the second one was Sierra Nevada's Bigfoot barley wine, which was first released in 1983. And I was actually reading, was flipping through the book Barleywine from Brewers Publications in the, I believe it's the Classic Beer Styles series. I was looking through that book in preparation for this. That book was released in 1998, and they cited those two beers, Bigfoot and Old Foghorn, as kind of like the preeminent examples of the American barley wine style. And I would say that even today, more than 20 years after that book was written, those are still kind of like if I had to pick two American barley wines as sort of like the standard bearers of the style, those are probably the two I would pick, which is kind of crazy, given how fast the American beer landscape has evolved and how quickly things shift. Like, I guarantee if you were like, in 1998, you were like, these are like the top 3 American IPAs that like represent the style. Some of them may still be in the running for like beers that are important today. Like, I'm not sure how long Bell's Two Hearted has been around, but I believe that that's one that is really prominent today and would have been prominent back then as well. But there's so many new entrants, especially if you look at like the hazy IPA style, which is the producers making popular versions of that iteration of IPA didn't even exist a decade ago in most cases. So the fact that like these two barley wines that have been being made for over 40 years in the case of Old Foghorn and almost 40 years in the case of Bigfoot are still kind of like the standard bearers for the style. I think that's really cool, and it's a testament to the quality of these beers. Bell's Two Hearted is the best. I can endorse that statement. I love a fresh Two Hearted. Anyways, I digress. Shayna tells me that Two Hearted was first brewed in 1997. Good year that must have been. So one other thing that I wanted to talk about before we talk about the recipe and other elements of the style is aging of these beers, because barley wines are one of the more common candidates that people will pick out as a style for aging. And one of the reasons why people will pick a beer like this is because there are a few reasons. One, higher alcohol content tends to protect beers to an extent against the ravages of age. Some of the less pleasant flavors that can show up in beer as it ages are mitigated, at least to some extent, in beers that are higher in alcohol. But also, beers that are higher in alcohol oftentimes are more intense, have more going on, and so there's more kind of like interesting things that can happen as the beers age, as they slowly oxidize. In the case of a beer like barley wine, where caramel and toffee flavors are already kind of an important part of the flavor profile, those flavors tend to deepen as the beer ages. So that's another reason why people will sometimes look to these beers as good candidates for aging. I'll say personally that, and this may be the unpopular opinion, but I don't really like to long age American barley wines. You compare American barley wine versus English barley wine. I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the biggest difference is American barley wines lean more into hop flavor and aroma. And as you may know, or if you don't know, hop flavor and aroma and hop bitterness are some of the first things that tend to fall off as beer ages. So, you take an American barley wine, you age it for 5 years, you're going to see some really interesting development of the malt character. But a lot of American barley wines also have pretty prominent hop flavor and aroma to them, and that's really going to fall off as the beer ages. So, Sierra Nevada vintage dates their bottles of Bigfoot barley wine. It has a year, usually on the cap, I believe. I've done verticals of Bigfoot before, and it's interesting, and I definitely enjoyed it. But I would say I like Bigfoot best within a year, maybe 2 years of when it was packaged, which still for like for an average beer, that would be a really long time. But I see people sometimes holding on to these beers for 10, 15, 20 years. And if you like them best at that point, that's awesome. For me personally, I feel like they lose a lot of what makes them really good at that point. Bigfoot in particular has tons of like cascade driven hop flavor and aroma, and 5 years that's gone. So my personal feeling on those is I like to drink them within a year or so of when they've been packaged, but that's a personal preference thing. English barley wines, on the other hand, I think do make really good candidates for aging because they are these just like high alcohol malt bombs, and they do continue to develop in interesting ways as they age. I've had English barley wines that were 15 or 20 years old that were just absolutely exceptional and mind-blowing experiences. So yeah, that's all I have to say on aging of these beers. As often is the case when it comes to questions about whether or not you should age something and how long you should age something, my bottom line answer is it really does come down to personal preference, in that if you like the way it tastes better after it's sat for a year, 3 years, or 10 years, like, awesome, go for it, age it. That's totally reasonable. Let's see. So talk a little bit about the recipe. Barley wines actually usually have a pretty simple recipe. One of the things about this style, and I meant to mention this when I was talking about the history, but at Cicerone, we talk a lot about style ladders, or different families having style ladders, where basically you have one recipe, and then as you sort of like dial it up, either typically by just increasing the amount of ingredient that you're using. So you have like one standard recipe of like pale ale malt and American hops. And if you dial up the amount that you're using of both of those, you get to another rung on the ladder that is a different style. It's very similar profile wise, but and has a similar recipe, but is considered a different style based just on the increase in alcoholic strength and overall intensity of the beer. And you see a lot of these especially in like German traditions and English traditions. Like simple example of one in Germany would be like Munich Dunkel. You step that up, you get a Märzen. You step that up, you get a Dunkelsbach. You step that up, you get a Doppelbock. That's all kind of like one continuum of basically the same recipe, but you're just increasing the strength at each step. There are ladders for dark beer. If you look at like, at least especially historically, how dark beers evolved in the UK, you would have had like porter and stout and double stout and imperial stout. It was all basically the same recipe, but just higher alcoholic strength and more intense flavor as you went up the ladder. So in the world of pale ale, you have kind of like your basic recipe for, in the UK, either some variety of bitter, or in the US, American pale ale. And as you increase the strength, you go kind of from pale ale up to IPA. And the sort of the top point of that ladder is barley wine. It has a very similar recipe proportionally, or in terms of the ingredients that are used, to something like an American pale ale. It's just twice as strong, or in some cases more than twice as strong as your American pale ale would be. So you're looking at a grist of usually pale ale malt with some amount of crystal malt mixed in. It depends on the producer how much they're going to use. British versions would lean more towards mostly pale malt with a little bit of crystal malt. I would imagine that American producers of barley wine and American barley wines are probably a little bit more heavy-handed with crystal malt or caramel malt. Hopping on these beers is usually going to be some sort of American varietal, though any New World varietal is appropriate. And really, I think the style guideline says that like anything can be used in these. So while you're most likely to see American varietals and those two kind of traditional examples, Bigfoot, I believe, is all Cascade. Old Foghorn, I believe, is all Cascade. Bigfoot, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that Cascade is a significant portion, especially of the late hopping for that beer. So classic American hop varieties in those beers, though you can make American barley wine with any sort of hops. But hops play a very important role in this style, more so than in English barley wines. Last but not least, it's going to be some sort of ale yeast used in the fermentation. A lot of times American ale yeasts are not super characterful. They don't produce a ton of ester character. However, if you make them chew through a really, really high gravity wort, as you are doing in the case of producing a beer that is this sort of like strong and rich, you're going to get more significant production of esters and other fermentation flavor compounds. So while it's not the most characterful of yeast strains, you do still get a reasonable amount of flavor from that fermentation just because it's a much higher gravity wort that you're working with. So let's talk a little bit about flavor profile. Malt sort of leads the way on this example on the Old Foghorn. And in my experience, barley wines usually are rather even in terms of their balance. They're very intense beers. So they're going to be intense in their maltiness and their hoppiness, but usually they're relatively balanced. And some iterations will lean a little bit more towards malt. Some will lean a little bit more towards hops, but usually relatively evenly matched. I would say the Old Foghorn leans a little bit more towards maltiness. There's a lot of caramel and toffee type malt flavors, and then almost a little bit of like a candy apple kind of character to it. But it does still have a fair amount of hop aroma. In particular, it's kind of like pine needle, resiny, a little bit like grapefruit peel, or maybe even like tangerine flesh. And then once again, I would say on the palate, Old Foghorn at least is balanced a little bit more towards sweetness. Still is pretty bitter, has kind of like a pronounced to maybe even an assertive bitterness. But there's a lot of residual sugar here that's blunting the perception of bitterness. American barley wines as a style are usually going to have a fair amount of residual sweetness to them, but some of them still are like screamingly bitter. I think I don't know if I saw somebody throw this one out, but like Rogue Old Crustacean in particular is one that's known for, when it's fresh, it's just like abrasively, aggressively bitter. And I would say, like my recollection of Stone's Old Guardian, when that's fresh, it is real bitter. So these styles can be very, very, very bitter, but still balanced by a fair amount of residual sugar. And then one other thing that's pretty universal in these beers is that they are super full in body, almost like chewy in terms of how thick and viscous they are. And that's a product of that really high original gravity, high finishing gravity, high amount of residual sweetness. A lot of things go into that thick, rich body that you find in these beers. So let's talk about a few style comparisons. What are similar styles to American barley wine? I think the one that makes the most sense to compare to is English barley wine. Like I mentioned earlier, English barley wine versus American barley wine. American barley wine is an adaptation of English barley wine, and an adaptation that features significantly higher rates of hopping. So English barley wine is first and foremost a very malty beer. It is like a super scaled up version of a British bitter. So there is still some hop aroma, some hop flavor, some amount of hop bitterness. But first and foremost, English barley wine is a malty malt bomb of a beer. And so I would say that's the key difference between these two styles. American barley wine is going to be higher in terms of its perceived bitterness. It's going to have more hop flavor, more hop aroma, less perceived maltiness just because of the hop attributes that are there. The other style that makes a lot of sense, I think, to compare to American barley wine is double IPA. I was talking about how American barley wine is sort of the top rung of the American Pale Ale, American IPA ladder. And I would consider American barley wine like a more natural extension of that ladder than double IPA is. The reason being that with double IPA, what brewers are often looking to do is they're looking to make a beer that really just focuses on the hop flavor and aroma and on hop bitterness. There can be a little bit of malt character, but that's not it's not a huge player in double IPA typically. When you look at these style ladders, in general, all attributes increase in intensity as you go up the ladder. And when I think of double IPAs, in a lot of cases, like the level of malt flavor and aroma in a double IPA is oftentimes less than you would find even in an American Pale Ale. It's really just like a super scaled up version that's sort of within that realm, but is all about the hops. And the way that brewers do that is a lot of brewers will use adjuncts like simple sugar to help boost the alcohol content, but lighten the body and lighten the malt flavor and aroma that you get in that style of beer, versus American barley wine, which is typically going to be all malt. And because of that, you get a much higher amount of malt flavor and aroma, and you get a much fuller body in these beers. So compared with double IPA, American barley wine is going to be fuller in body. It's going to have a lot more malt flavor, malt aroma. It's going to have more residual sweetness. And while they may, in some cases, have similar IBU values, in a lot of cases, double IPAs are going to be more perceivably bitter just because they don't have all of that malt and that body and the residual sweetness there to kind of dampen some of the bitterness like you see in an American barley wine. Let's see. I see here somebody asking how you'd compare with Imperial Stout. This is a pretty different beer than an Imperial Stout. They do share some similar characteristics in that they're both very high alcohol beers, full body, might have some residual sweetness. But the big difference is that you're never going to see an American barley wine that's black in color. It should be, they usually fall somewhere in kind of the amber range, a lot of caramel and toffee notes, whereas Imperial Stouts are pretty firmly in just like the opaque black, tons of roast character, chocolate, coffee, espresso, really leading the way in those beers versus the kind of caramel toffee malt notes that you get in this. And also Imperial Stouts can have some amount of hop presence. Usually are not going to be super forward in their hop flavor and aroma, which most American barley wines are. So let's see. Last thing I want to talk about before I dig into questions is pairing. And pairing can be tough with these beers, in part because they're so intense that they don't lend well to as kind of like an accompaniment to most dishes. And in a lot of cases, they would either run the dish over, or because they're so kind of like oftentimes somewhat sweet, very intense, very much a sipping beer, they're not a good refresher alongside food. It's not, once again, it's not something you're going to kind of like throw back while you're eating something else. It's usually a beer. I've always thought of barley wine as like, I want like a snifter, I want a high back chair, I want like a smoking jacket and a roaring fire. I want it to be snowing outside. I'm like sitting in front of the fire and sipping my barley wine and thinking about, I don't know, something important. That is like my image of barley wine, and it does not involve food. However, if you're determined to pair barley wine with something, I would say probably the areas it's best suited to would be cheeses. In particular, like Stilton and barley wine, like a really intense blue cheese, is a pretty classic combination. And once again, that kind of follows along that sort of like IPA blue cheese idea, but just taking it up a notch. So something like an intense blue cheese, or maybe like a heavily aged Gouda that's just like really dense and a lot of nutty caramel toffee, very similar flavors in that case. I would probably prefer the blue cheese route, where you have more contrasting elements. It makes for a more interesting pairing in my mind. But you pit this up against something like a 5-year Gouda, and you're going to get a lot of overlap in terms of flavors that you see. It will still make for an interesting and probably enjoyable experience. Outside of that, there's some desserts that can work with American barley wine. I would say if I was going to put a barley wine up against dessert, I'd probably go English barley wine over American barley wine, just because the hop bitterness and hop flavor and aroma can kind of be like a confounding factor if you were trying to pair with a dessert. There's some cases where like a chocolate dessert or maybe like a creme brulee might work. But in a lot of cases, I would think that you could probably find a better beer to match with most desserts than something like this. So if you must have food with your barley wine, I would say go with cheese. Otherwise, like, just sit there and sip it and enjoy it. It's a meal in and of itself. And there's nothing, you don't have to pair every beer. So. All right, let's take a look at some of these questions. So Greg asks, are Bigfoot and Old Foghorn considered the standard because of not many more companies making this style? That could be part of it. I mean, that's one thing with IPAs. There's so many people making IPAs today that at this point I'd be hard pressed to point to 3 or 5 that I'd be like, these are definitive American IPA. Whereas American barley wine is a little bit more of a niche style. And I do feel like when I try to think of good classic examples of the style, a lot of them are made by sort of more traditional, like, I don't think you can call them heritage breweries, but like heritage craft breweries, like Sierra Nevada or Anchor. Like, I just got done with a really long road trip, and I was in Boulder briefly, and I met up with a buddy of mine from Avery Brewing Company, and they for years have made this beer, Hog Heaven, that is a really excellent example of an American barley wine, and they're discontinuing that beer. We were talking about this like 2 weeks ago because not enough people want to drink barley wine, which, I get it. It's not a beer you drink in volume, but so like Avery used to be a classic producer of it. Victory's, Old Horizontal, Stone, Old Guardian. I think I saw somebody drinking a Weyerbacher. I think it's Blithering Idiot. Rogue, Old Crustacean. All of these are from craft breweries that are like at least 20 years old, maybe longer, which in this day and age is like, that's an old American brewery. So yeah, I think you do see fewer examples of this style produced. I do think a lot of American craft breweries will still dabble with the style as a specialty. Not a lot will release it as kind of like a standard part of their lineup, in part because, you know, these are really resource intensive beers to make. I can't remember if it's in Brewmaster's table or not, but I have this recollection of reading Garrett Oliver's sort of him talking about brewing Brooklyn's barley wine, which I believe was Monster barley wine, and I think that was discontinued several years ago. But you know, this is a beer that takes a tremendous amount of malt, and in some cases, brewers are going to have to like basically like stuff their mash tun to the absolute brim with malt in order to produce these beers. And I remember everything that Garrett writes is super romantic, but him talking about brewing that beer, he's like, you know, like we put on this music and and the aromas and like all this, like there's romanticism to this style to an extent. But it's not something you want to make on a everyday basis. Even Sierra Nevada, who I would say has one of the most important examples of this style, they release this beer once a year. I want to say they release it in like late January, early February is I think when Bigfoot comes out. So yeah, it's not a beer that people are making all the time, which somebody else said it was kind of difficult to find. I didn't have too much trouble finding Old Foghorn, but beyond that, yeah, I can imagine it being challenging to find. Bigfoot is usually pretty easy to find if you've got Sierra Nevada in your area around the time that they produce it or around the time that they release it. But at this point, that was 8 or 9 months ago. So I doubt that I would be able to lay my hands on a 6-pack of Bigfoot at this point. And yeah, I mean, some of the other variants you might find at a bottle shop, but it can be a tough style to dig up. It is, I think a lot of the breweries that produce it usually like once a year. It's not necessarily a seasonal, but it's something that in a lot of cases is not produced as a year-round brand for many breweries. And I don't like to confine beers to seasons. I think most beers can work at most times of year, but there is something to be said for like hunkering down when it's cold out and like enjoying a glass of barley wine, preferably by a roaring fire that no one has available to them. But it's just this nice image that I have in my head whenever I drink barley wine. What else is out there? Let's see. Chris Connors asks, can you talk a little bit about the alcoholic burn? Is that part of mouthfeel? How do some high ABV beers hide it better than others? That's actually a really, really good point and something I should have mentioned. So, you know, with higher alcohol beers, one of the things that you get, and it is a mouthfeel trait, is alcohol warmth. An actual sort of warming sensation in your mouth. And it is actually alcohol stimulating thermal receptors, just like you would have if like you expose your tongue to heat. It's a very similar sensation. That's why people talk about it as warmth or as heat. And you usually won't see any perceivable alcohol warmth in anything below like 7% alcohol. And beyond that point, you start to notice a little bit of warmth as the beer increases in alcohol. Now, you can get beers that are 12, 14% alcohol that have a lot of that warming presence, but don't have, like, when people describe a beer as having like a hot alcohol character, it's usually a harshness, kind of a burning note. You can get beers that are higher in alcohol that have a lot of warmth without becoming hot. I've never seen a really good explanation of what exactly it is that makes beers develop that more kind of like hot, harsh quality. My understanding of it is that usually it's going to be production of higher alcohols during fermentation. So people will talk about, you'll sometimes hear people talk about higher alcohols or fusel alcohols. These are the main alcohol that's found in beer is ethanol. These are alcohols that have a longer carbon chain than ethanol. Ethanol is a 2-carbon alcohol. So propanol, I know, is pretty common, or like isopropyl. And I don't know if you get much isopropyl formed by yeast, but propanol is definitely one of the higher alcohols that can appear. Isoamyl alcohol, phenylethyl alcohol. There are a number of these other alcohols that can form that, when they're present at high concentrations, tend to take on sort of a solventy note and have kind of like a harsh burning sort of quality to them. So I've seen a lot of people will point to fusel alcohols as sort of the culprit of hot quality in a beer that exhibits that trait. I'm not sure if that's the entire story, but that's at least what I've heard. And a lot of that is going to come back to the fermentation, depending upon how the fermentation is managed. And, that's fermentation temperature, but also pitching rate, how much yeast you add, what the nutrient profile is like, since fusel alcohols are usually, the formation of fusel alcohols depends on the amino acid profile of the wort, which I'm like, we're not going to get into that because it's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. But the nutrient profile of the wort, particularly the amount of free amino nitrogen available and the types of amino acids that are present, can dictate what gets produced. Anecdotally, I don't have any explanation for like a mechanism behind this. I've never seen anything reported for like how this would work, so I don't know exactly how it would work, but aging anecdotally will sort of smooth out some of the rough edges of a beer that exhibits more alcohol warmth. In spirit production, you want to talk about like alcohol heat. If you have ever taken a shot or just drank like a undiluted liquor or spirit that has a high enough alcohol content and enough other sort of fusel alcohols and other components going on, that it has a variant of whiskey. Whiskey softens over time as it ages in wood, but part of that is like compounds in the wood filtering out some of that harsh character. I'm not sure if oxidation alone can do that, but like I said, anecdotally, if you got a beer that's really hot, you lay it down for 2-3 years, it can integrate and the alcohol can be a little bit smoother and easier to tolerate. And I don't know exactly how that happens or what the mechanism is for that, but that's another reason why these styles are sometimes candidates for aging, is that sometimes they are a little hot or harsh when they're young, and with time that can become a little better integrated. Tom asks, both of my barley wine examples were aged in bourbon barrels. Is that typical? Why would brewers do that? Why indeed? Bourbon barrel aging is something that brewers do to add interesting, unique flavors to beers. And in particular, a lot of higher alcohol styles are good candidates for barrel aging, in part because they already have pretty intense flavors that are going to be able to hopefully stand up to the intense flavors that the barrels themselves are imparting to the beer, so that you still get some of the beer underlying that bourbon flavor. Also, barrel aging necessarily involve some amount of aging. So you're going to get some oxidation, some age character to development. So a stronger, higher ABV beer is going to hold up better in a barrel than something lower in alcohol would. So, probably the most common beers that you see get aged in bourbon barrels are dark beers, things like imperial stouts, high alcohol porters. And part of that, I think, is there is, bourbon in particular has lots of flavors of like brown sugar and vanilla and coconut and molasses from the way that those barrels are treated before whiskey is stored in them. And so that kind of category of flavors plays really nicely with the sort of chocolate coffee espresso notes that you get in dark beers like imperial stouts. Those flavors also tend to work really well with sort of the caramel toffee profile that you would see in a barley wine. So while I'd say it's less common to see a bourbon barrel aged barley wine than a bourbon barrel aged stout, at this point in time, there may be more bourbon barrel barley wines on the market than unbarrel aged or not barrel aged barley wines. And yes, Foghorn and Bigfoot are not barrel aged. If you look at the BJCP guidelines, it'll give you a list of classic examples. Anything that they list is going to be, like I said, a classic example of the style. It's not going to be some variation on the style. And anything that is, bourbon barrel aged version, that is the brewer made a barley wine and was like, we want to put this in bourbon barrels to, develop it in a certain way. I want to say Goose Island's, I think it was King Henry, and I don't know if they even still make it, but I think King Henry was their barley wine that was part of their Bourbon County brand stout series. They did a bourbon barrel aged barley wine called King Henry. I could be remembering that wrong. I think the last time I had it was like a decade ago, but that's all I have to say about that one. Let's see. Question: could you please elaborate on barrel aging barley wine? Should it be classified as something else? Wood beer. So when you talk about like very specific classification like that, oftentimes it matters most in the context of competitions. Like, and I will say, like, when we teach about styles, we teach according to the BJCP guidelines. We teach about sort of classic examples of styles. When you look at beer on the market today, there is so much beer that falls outside of those classic guidelines, but still a lot of times there's going to be a base style to the beer, whether that's like a agave lime goza, like that's a goza. If you understand goza and then can be like, okay, well, they also added lime and agave to it. Like, I understand how that would change that profile. Understanding the base style allows you to understand what the modified version might be like. Same sort of thing with a bourbon barrel aged anything. If you understand what an imperial stout or a barley wine or I don't know, a Scottish ale or a wee heavy, that like if you understand the base style and then can say, okay, they aged in bourbon barrels, so it's going to have some bourbon character to it. That allows you to understand what that beer is going to be like. And that's just, it's a variation on a style. So when I look at that, I go, I'm not trying to classify it as like its own style. It is a variation on an established style. Where the sort of the classification becomes important is if that beer is being entered in a competition. Because if you are judging American barley wines and someone throws their bourbon barrel barley wine in there, well, American barley wine as a style in a competition setting should not have strong bourbon flavors that you get from bourbon barrel aging. If you were to enter it in that style category, probably would just be they would just be kicked out. It would, judges would say, if it was a nice beer, they'd say it's a nice beer, but it doesn't fit the style. So in terms of entering in a competition, in a BJCP competition, they have a category of wood beers that that would probably include, or would probably be the place to enter that. And a lot of times with the wood beer category, you specify, the way that it was aged, or you specify the underlying style as well. So you'd say it's American barley wine is aged in bourbon barrels. Similarly, at a competition like GABF, they have categories for beers that are aged in wood, or beers that are aged in bourbon barrels. And for styles that are like really popular, like a bourbon barrel stout, that may have its own distinct category, and then they may also have like an other bourbon barrel beers category for something like a bourbon barrel barley wine. And that was like way more about that than you probably wanted to know, but we went into it anyway. Let's see. Frank asked, we had a flight at a small new brew pub, and all the light colored beers smelled and tasted strongly like creamed corn, but not the stout. Dark and high alcohol beers cover certain brewing flaws. Mixed bag on that. So one thing, as as the intensity and flavor increases, it can mask some flavors, or just other flavors generally. When we talk about threshold for certain flavor compounds, the amount of flavor compound that needs to be present in order for you to perceive it, threshold varies depending upon the beer that the compound is present in. If you had diacetyl in a light American lager and diacetyl in American barley wine, and it was the same concentration, it would smell a lot more strongly in the light American lager than in the American barley wine, just because there wasn't as much competing aromas going on. In this case, creamed corn is most often indicative of DMS, dimethyl sulfide, which is a specific flaw that is associated with the use of pale malts. And so, while you can still get DMS in a dark beer, because dark beers are usually still mostly pale malt, you're more likely to encounter DMS in something like a Helles or a cream ale, lighter colored beers. So, could be that the stout, like the higher alcohol and the more intense flavor, was covering that up, but it could just be that the recipe of that beer didn't lend as much to that flavor being produced. Let's see. This is gonna be the last one I take, because now we're really getting out there, and this is about rye wine and wheat wine. Would I categorize those as in line with American barley wine, or would it be considered a strong ale? So if you look in BJCP guidelines, they do have a specific style for wheat wine, and it's actually pretty significantly different from American barley wine. It's not as highly hopped. It's a lot more estery. It's still high alcohol. It features a lot of wheat, as you might expect from the name. But I've seen breweries produce things like rye wines, where it's a high alcohol beer made with a significant portion of rye, or oat wines, where it's a high alcohol beer made with a significant portion of oats. In general, I would not consider them, they're not distinct styles, because not enough people are making them. And when they are being made, they're not being made by some like, oh, every time people make oat wines, they sort of follow this trend. It is very much a riff on the barley wine style. It's just a strong beer that's made with that ingredient. And when it comes to like categorizing it as a style, if it were to get categorized for like competition, I believe there are like alternative grain or like alternative fermentable beverages, where you could say this is like it's like an American barley wine, but made with a lot of rye. So a quick comment on that about like, how would you categorize this? I'm not a big fan of like working too hard to categorize beers into like discrete styles. Learning about styles is extremely important, I think. in the context of learning about beer, because learning about styles helps you to understand how different beers are made in different places, what sorts of flavors you should generally expect in a beer that's labeled a certain way, those sorts of things. But in the context of like, with what people are doing today, where they have a fruited this or a spiced this, or trying to tie it into like a tight style definition, I don't think that that's super important. The only place where that is important is if that brewery is trying to enter that beer in a competition, because you need to do a good job of selecting the appropriate category for your beer if you are entering it in competition to give it the best shot of doing well. But outside of that, in the context of just like enjoying beer, like I think it's so Dogfish Head makes a beer called Sea Quench that is, they call it's like a blend of like a Gose, a Kolsch, and a Berliner Weiss with black limes and sea salt. And to me, it's like, it's, if I look at the beer, I go, it's closest to a Gose. The other parts of it, like, that doesn't matter that much to me. It's like a Gose with black limes. So, and even that analysis of it, like, isn't super important. At the end of the day, like, know enough about the style that it kind of helps guide you to understanding the flavors of the beer a little bit better, but don't like, I would say it's one of the things that like will frustrate like bartenders or people will be like, why are you so like obsessing over like what style is this? It largely, for these beers that fall outside of well-defined styles, it largely doesn't matter. Like, it's close to a certain style, but the style name is really just a jumping off point to help you understand what flavors will likely be there. And for some of these variations, they go so far abreast of what we have as defined styles that you aren't going to be able to put a nicely packaged style name on it. So that is all that I have for today. I want to thank you guys for coming and drinking this decidedly not terribly crushable beer with me. We'll be back next week talking about Belgian Triple, which, while a high alcohol beer, is dangerously drinkable. Should be a fun session. And when we get together next week, I'll have a better idea what's going on for the rest of the month. So see you guys in a week. Thanks for swinging by.